Mr. Chair, it is 7 o'clock.
Recording in progress.
7 o'clock and we are recording.
So it is. Bringing the August 3rd, 2023 Corcoran Planning Commission meeting. Let's see. Roll call. Drummond.
Here.
Horn. Here. Lind.
Here.
Lanterman is present and Bandiniti is absent for this meeting. And congratulations, Commissioner Lind. I'd like to ask you to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Commissioners and staff, does anyone have any changes, amendments, additions to tonight's agenda?
No, Chair, I don't.
No? Okay, great. Moving right along.
We do need a motion to approve, first and second.
I'll make that motion to approve tonight's agenda.
And we have a second. Thank you.
Vote.
I would like to open the...
Mr. Chair, I'm so sorry, we need a vote too.
Oh gosh, you know, I get rusty at these things. Can I? So I have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Okay. Now can I go?
Yes, you can
Thank
go on, thank you.
I'd like to open the floor to the public to participate in the open forum, and this is a time for you to discuss with us any topic that is not currently on tonight's agenda.
Members of the public online, if you'd like to participate in the open agenda, please raise your hand utilizing the raise your hand function on your reactions menu. No hands are raised online, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Let's see. Any, staff or commissioners, any questions or comments on the minutes from our last meeting? No?
Do we need to approve them?
Yes.
So I'll make a motion to approve last month's meeting minutes.
And let's take a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Okay. So new business. Now, materials relating to this agenda or to these items can be found in a packet by the door. So if you're looking to follow along, if you would like to, you certainly may. But before we start, I just want to thank Natalie for her service. I really enjoy reading your reports. They're clear and thorough, and that is not a small task, especially for tonight's agenda. I thought that they were surprisingly complicated with lots of moving parts, and I want to emphasize how much I appreciate it, because if it weren't for your work on these, at least I would not know where to start. So thank you. I'd like to open the public hearing about the Red Barn Pet Retreat, which is City File 23008. This will be quick because all we are doing now is continuing the public hearing until September 7th, 2023. The applicant is still working to revise plans. So for the reasons I've just mentioned, I would like to make a motion to continue the public hearing on this file until September 7th, 2023.
I'll second.
We have a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Thank you. Moving along, I'd like to open the public hearing for the Bennett Garage CUP, which is City File number 23-014. Staff, Natalie, you have the floor to give us your report, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Bennett Garage CUP, the applicant is Lee Bennett, and the CUP would allow for an accessory building that exceeds a building sidewall height of 10 feet in their side yard. The subject property is at 10208 think it's Hague Drive. It's right off of Oakdale Drive, and the accessory structure is expected to store his RV and personal groundkeeping equipment. The applicant did already submit a revised grading and drainage plan today to address the engineering memo, so we appear to be one step further in meeting some of the conditions of approval outlined in the staff report, and this will be reviewed further by engineering to confirm compliance. Overall, the structure is to be placed in the side yard and meets or exceeds all the required setbacks. The accessory structure footprint is 1,040 square feet, where 1,375 square feet is allowed. The proposed sidewall height for the garage is 12 feet, which can be allowed through the CUP process, and the building does not exceed the overall structure height limit in either the rural residential district or the 25-foot height limit in the shoreland overlay. The proposed architecture, shingles, and lap siding with stone veneer comply with the material requirements, and overall staff finds the standards for the CUP have been met with the proposed conditions of approval. And so just to quickly go over those, the structure cannot be used for commercial purposes without first obtaining proper city approvals. And the applicant must revise their plan. So again, we appear to have been make progress on the engineering portion, and then they have to make a slight adjustment to the overhangs. They must be at least 1.5 feet. So keeping it short and sweet, we recommend opening the public hearing to take any testimony, and staff recommends approval of the draft resolution in your packet.
Thank you. I'd like to open the public hearing. In-person comments will be taken first. I will ask that speakers attempt to limit comments to 5 minutes if you don't mind. I don't have a stopwatch. I'm not going to cut you off. Don't make fun of her. You can have 6 minutes. And Natalie, do you want to walk through the process of participating via Zoom?
Yes, members of the public online, if you would like to participate in the public hearing, please utilize the raise your hand function within the reactions menu. And no one is raising their hand online.
Okay, with that, can I get a motion to close the public hearing?
I'll make a motion to close the public hearing.
I'll second that motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Thank you. Deliberations, anyone want to start, or would you like me to go?
I just had one question for staff, and that is, what is the, or do we know the reasoning for the 18-inch overhang?
I believe, my understanding is that was put in place to try to encourage a certain residential aesthetic instead of agricultural buildings when you were doing some of these accessory structures.
Okay, thank you.
Nope.
For right now.
Okay, well, I have a question, and I'm not sure if this is for Natalie or Mr. Bennett. Is Mr. Bennett with us? You're
Yes.
Mr. Bennett? Okay, thank you, sir. Are you part of an HOA?
I am not, no.
Okay. So you're not in an HOA?
Correct.
Okay, the reason I ask is because I wouldn't want to get into a situation where perhaps this project violates HOA covenants, and then if we were to approve this application, now we're kind of in the middle of a dispute that we have no place of being in. Okay, all right. Because of course, you know, we're not the HOA if one did exist there. So, okay, thank you. All right, thank you. That was the only thing that I wanted to ask. Does anyone have any comments or questions or other topics to discuss on this? Well, with that, I'd like to make a motion to approve the application for the CUP so that Mr. Bennett can exceed the structure height limit of 10 feet to a height of no more than 12 feet.
I'll second.
Can I get a vote? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Very good. Thank you. Congratulations. like to open the public hearing, excuse me, for the rezoning, site plan, variances, and conditional use permit for Corcoran Storage 2 at 23730 Highway 55, which is city file number 23-016. Natalie, you have the floor to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm actually going to give this one to Kendra, as her team was able to prepare this report.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kendra.
You have the clicker, Natalie, right? So,
Mhm.
next slide. This property is in the southwest corner of the city. It's guided light industrial and zoned urban reserve. Urban reserve is a holding zone in the metropolitan urban service area until municipal services are available. The surrounding properties to the north and east are also guided light industrial and zoned urban reserve. The property to the south across Highway 55 is in Medina and is zoned rural residential urban reserve. And the property to the west is in the city of Greenfield and zoned rural residential. On the property on the east side in that wooded area, there is an existing single-family home and 2 accessory structures that would be removed as part of this project. Next slide. The request has 4 different components. The rezoning from urban reserve to light industrial, a site plan approval, a conditional use permit to allow mini storage, self-storage, and 3 variances. The first is to allow development in the MUSA in advance of municipal sewer and water. The second is to allow the required buffer yard to be located outside of the subject property. That's related to the buffer yard ordinance that you reviewed in April and the council adopted. And then third, to allow a 20-foot setback on the north and east where 50 feet is required. All of the applications are tied together, so as you read the report and as I go through it, we'll kind of reference that, but I'll go through each of them individually. Next slide. As I said, the rezoning is, the property is guided light industrial, and the request to be rezoned to I-1 is consistent with the land use. However, the district, the I-1 district, says the rezoning will occur when municipal services are available. So the first variance relates to this rezoning. The rezoning can't be approved without that first variance, which says it can be rezoned in advance of municipal services. This is something we've done. In fact, this applicant received approval of a similar variance for garages 2 east of this property between Pioneer Trail and Rolling Hills Road last year. And so the staff report outlines the rezoning standards and provides possible findings for both approval and denial because, again, as I said, they're all tied together. So I'm not going to go through that. You've read the report, but I just want to highlight that for the public. Next slide. Kind of off the screen, but in the very bottom corner is the property. Next slide. We'll just skip past that. The site plan now is for a mini storage, self-storage facility. There are 56 individual rental units in 6 different buildings. So you would come in off Highway 55 and turn right into the property, and then on the north side would be 3 buildings, on the south side 3 additional buildings. The lot standards are met with this project. It's a single lot. There's no subdivision required. It's an existing lot of record. The setbacks are met on the west and the south, but not on the north and the east. The code requires a 50-foot setback to residential. Urban Reserve is a residential zoning district, and the applicant is proposing a 20-foot setback on those 2 property lines. Again, that's a variance, so that will affect the site plan discussion. There is no parking provided. There is a wide common driveway, and the idea with storage units like this is you come in, drop off your stuff, pick up your stuff, and leave. So there's really no need for parking, but it is wide enough that vehicles can be parked in front of the rental units and an emergency vehicle could get through. There is no lighting plan provided. However, we would expect that for safety purposes, there likely would be some lighting, so we've included a condition, if you do approve it, that a lighting plan would need to be provided. The design standards for the building, the city code includes design standards for commercial industrial buildings. This site is in the southeast district, in the southwest district, and the Appendix A of the code includes some additional very generic standards for design standards in that district. The building rendering on the bottom shows 2 different colors of integral color concrete block walls. The bottom wainscoting is a contrasting color. There's lap siding on the gable elements of the building, the pieces that look white on this, but there were no details about the materials themselves. The city code does allow fiber cement lap siding. That would be a permitted use in the industrial district, but not vinyl siding. I hope the applicant maybe can provide some information about those materials. Alternatively, the Planning Commission could weigh in on whether you believe vinyl siding would be appropriate in this district. There is flexibility built into the code for other materials to be considered. Next slide. This image is the site plan, and the checked area that is on the north and the east is the buffer. That straddles the lot line. 20 feet of it's on this property, and the other 20 feet is on the adjacent property. On the west side of the property, we see a 50-foot buffer adjacent to that driveway. The driveway is a private drive proposed within a 40-foot public street easement. So they would dedicate a 40-foot public street easement to the city. Again, it's not a plat, so they wouldn't dedicate it, but we would get the easement. And that would align with the existing right-of-way in Greenfield. The Highway 55 corridor does provide the buffer under our new code from the residential property in Medina. Next slide. So that street access would be new. You can see on the image of the Southeast District that the plan is to have that continue through and ultimately, in some way, shape, or form, make a connection out to 19. So it would provide service to this southwest industrial district in the city. The dedication of that street easement does meet the requirements. We've met with the city of Greenfield on this property just to talk about the project and the right-of-way that they have in their long-term plan. So we've started that discussion. Greenfield doesn't have any immediate plans to do anything, but is supportive of the concept with the additional right-of-way. The new access onto Highway 55, however, does require MnDOT approval. We have sent the plans to MnDOT. We have not received comments from MnDOT, so that is a condition of approval in the staff report. Additionally, the private drive in that public easement does require an encroachment agreement. We've done those elsewhere. Nelson, Park Place Storage, just north of this, they both are similar situations where we've got a private improvement in a public right-of-way, and the city attorney has prepared a template agreement for that. The plans have been reviewed by Public Safety, and one of their comments is that the applicant does need to provide a turning radius to ensure that emergency vehicles can maneuver through the site, that the turnarounds do comply with city code. There is a gate at the entrance. The gate narrows the driveway up, but still is 21 feet wide, which is wide enough for the fire code. There is significant grading on the site. There are 3-to-1 slopes around the building. The grading would result in a finished floor that's about 8 feet higher than the property line on the north and east of this site. There is grading in the MnDOT right-of-way, which will require MnDOT approval. City engineer has reviewed the grading plan and has provided some comments that would be a condition of approval should that be your recommendation. There's no big development sign. There's a small sign on the west side of Building A that really provides contact information. It's not an advertising sign. It's about 15 square feet. That complies with our code requirements. The stormwater, there are a number of stormwater comments, which is fairly typical, as you know. Engineering has reviewed them and provided comments to the applicant. One of the challenges on this site relates to the landscape code and the new buffer ordinance. And so there's a lengthy discussion in the staff report about that. And one of the things as we apply this new buffer ordinance that I want to talk through is how it works with the landscape ordinance. The code requires for the development on this site 50 overstory trees and 167 shrubs. when you calculate the standards for the west, north, and east buffers, the new buffer ordinance requires a total of 34 overstory trees, 51 understory trees, and 102 shrubs. There is something built into the buffer ordinance, as you will probably recall, that existing vegetation can be used to meet those requirements. The applicant is proposing to use off-site trees to meet those requirements, but there's no detail about those trees. We've looked at aerials, we've been to the site, but we don't really have the details to ensure that it meets the code requirements. If you wish to allow that, we would suggest that we get a tree survey that identifies that existing vegetation. On the west side, the buffer count is not met for the landscaping. There is landscaping there, but it doesn't meet the buffer requirements in that buffer zone. The plan shows a total of 61 overstory trees and 181 shrubs. Several of those overstory trees are located off-site, the new trees off-site, as well as the off-site trees they want to count. In applying this ordinance in real life for the first time, we realized that the code does not specifically say that the buffer landscaping is in addition to the required landscaping. I believe that was the intent of the buffer ordinance, and as part of this application, because of the conditional use and variances, the city, should they choose to approve it, could apply it that way. We do believe that it is intended to be in addition. The second part of the landscaping piece is that buffer yard. If you will recall, we specifically talked about whether buffer yards would be required to be on-site or if you could use the adjacent property. One of the example ordinances we talked about when we reviewed this was the city of Ramsey, who does allow you to use your neighbor's property to provide the required buffering. This city chose very specifically not to allow that. The applicant is now asking to be able to do that with not a permanent buffer easement, which our code requires, but with a temporary easement over the buffer on his property and the neighbor's property. So a variance is required. We'll talk about that a bit more, but those are important elements related to the landscaping. The other part is the 50-foot buffer on the west does not meet the landscaping requirements. There's some landscaping there, some overstory trees, but not the required shrubs. One of the things built into the ordinance is that the council has the discretion to allow local streets to provide the buffer. So a question for the Planning Commission and the council is, for that 50-foot buffer on the west, adjacent to Greenfield, can that street provide part of the required buffer? So that's a discussion we can have related to the landscaping. Again, there is landscaping in that 50-foot buffer, not the amount required under the code, but a nice amount of landscaping. And the question is, can that 40-foot street easement also help to offset that? Next slide. The conditional use for mini storage, self-storage, the conditions are discussed in the ordinance and repeated in the staff report, where we have provided some options for both approval and denial, again, tied to the variances and the rezoning. They just are really hard to review in a vacuum. So those standards for the conditional use permit, I believe, are fairly straightforward, so I didn't go through those in this slide. Next slide. Lastly, I think the meat of the item that everything else hinges on are the three variances. The variance number one is municipal services. The code requires municipal sanitary sewer and water to be available in the MUSA before rezoning from urban reserve to light industrial. However, it is a policy issue for the city. This particular use doesn't require municipal sanitary and sewer and water to operate. We had this discussion with garages too, and it's very similar. However, rezonings are an area where you have a lot of discretion, and so as you're reviewing the other components, you may find that taken as a whole, this doesn't meet the standards. We've provided possible findings for you for both approval and denial. The buffer yard requirements, The new ordinance requires buffer yard to be on site. I think that was very clear in our discussion with the council. That was very much what they wanted to see. The applicant is providing the buffer on their property and on their neighbor's property in a temporary easement. The code requires it to be entirely on your property and in a permanent easement. We really don't think they've met the variance standards on this one. We think staff, or planning commission, excuse me, and council discussed this possibility and chose not to approve it. Again, we've provided findings of fact for approval and denial, but is our feeling that the applicant has not met the threshold for the variance standards. On variance number 3, the setback from residential, it's based on the zoning. It is a residential zoning. There is a home on that property. The underlying land use for the purposes of this setback is irrelevant. The applicant would like a smaller setback, but has not provided any variance findings, in my opinion, to meet the variance standards. Again, it's discretionary. You have a lot of discretion, and therefore we've provided possible findings for both approval and denial for the Planning Commission. Again, just as a reminder of the site plan, and then in summary, if the variances are recommended for denial, the rezoning site plan and CUP also need to be denied. It doesn't work without everything being approved. Staff finds that the variance standards for the buffer and the setback have not been met. As a reminder, the applicant's responsibility is to show how they meet the variance standards. Economic considerations alone do not constitute a practical difficulty, and it is our opinion that a smaller project could comply with the ordinance requirements. However, you have discretion, and we've given you options for each of those applications. And on the next slide, there are 2 options. If you believe that the ordinance standards have been met for these 4 applications, you should recommend approval of the draft ordinance, approving the rezoning, findings of fact, conditional use permit and site plan, and the variances. If you find that they have not been met, we've given you a draft resolution denying all of the applications, and as always, amend as appropriate. Mr. Chair, happy to answer any questions, and the applicant is here with his engineer this evening.
Thank you, Kendra, and please thank Nicholas for his input on this as well. So with that, I'd like to open the public hearing to the public. If there's anyone here in person who has anything that they would like to bring to our attention or discuss with us about this project, now's the time. I understand that the applicant is here, and who would that be? Oh, okay. Is there anything that you folks would like to discuss with us before we close the public meeting?
Mr. Chair and Planning Commission members, my name is Scott Dahlke, project engineer. Thanks for your time in reviewing this application. Thanks to staff for going through it and giving us their comments. Well, we understand Kendra's comments about the buffer really is the big thing. I think the variance for the municipal utilities, I think that's very straightforward. I hope the buffer is probably the big one. One of the reasons, and Craig, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I know Kendra has mentioned a number of times that the easement that is proposed, the 20-foot easement on the adjacent property, is temporary. Well, why is it temporary? Yes, right? Well, I think it would help to make sure everybody understands the comprehensive plan and the land use around it, right, to the north and to the east is future industrial, right? So, yes, there needs to be this buffer dimension provided as long as it's residential, but once it were to be zoned to industrial, which it will happen at some point in time, it may not be in my lifetime, but it will happen at some point in time, then the buffer no longer applies, if I understand it, correct?
Could I ask you a question?
Sure.
How is this not spot zoning?
It's in line with what the comprehensive plan already proposes.
Okay, but how is this not spot zoning?
I guess that would be something that would be better answered by staff. I guess I don't have an answer for you on that one.
Okay, thank you. Please, go ahead.
So, if the future uses are industrial, and future buffer would no longer then apply, why would it be necessary to have a perpetual buffer easement then? If at some point in the future there would be no buffer required. So that's the reason why it would be considered temporary. And I think the understanding is that it would remain in place as long as that other property remained as a residential zone. Once it turned into an industrial zone, the easement could be removed. So, I think the intent is to comply and provide the required buffer with and the landscaping. And we did, although we don't have a landscape plan currently generated, we do agree with staff that we would do a tree survey of the existing trees out there. If it's deemed within that space that we're proposing for the buffer, if it's deemed that the existing vegetation, the existing trees are not satisfactory, there would either be supplemental plants added or the existing vegetation removed and trees planted that would then comply with the buffer requirement. So, at the end of the day, the goal is to comply with the required plantings. So yes, we would undertake a tree survey, work with staff, come up with what would be deemed an acceptable buffer yard. We are proposing to comply with the 40-foot option and a number of plant trees, understory, shrubs accordingly. As far as the other comments, engineering comments, drainage design, that kind of stuff, I don't see where there's any issue in complying with what engineering has raised, so we'll be able to work through those. We do understand we gotta get the Elm Creek watershed approval just like the other project, so we're fully on board with all that. So, would appreciate support to move forward. You know, we did identify in our narratives, you know, some of our the challenges with this site really is related to its configuration. It's very narrow. We just, you know, to get the size of buildings that are viable and efficient here, with a center drive aisle that works for the customers that will use this.
Could I ask you a
we need-
question?
Sure.
By viable, do you mean financially viable?
Well, I think overall development-wise viable. I mean, does it do any good to have a project that gets built and nobody wants to use it because it's not functional for them?
Right, and because it wouldn't make financial sense.
Oh, it would do my financial sense for the owner, financial sense for the users.
Okay, thank you.
That would make no financial sense for the city either. We want to have something that's successful. And I would think the city would want something that's successful. So the shape of the parcel is really the driver of what makes some challenges here. And the code, the buffer code, it does say that buffer yards must be provided within a permanent easement. I do want to go back and read and specifically see, I guess I did not see that it was written in there that it was specified that it had to be on the parcel. I do remember reading that it was to be within a permanent easement. But we will confirm that.
May I
Anything else?
ask a question?
Sure.
Your clientele, the target market, is this intended for long-term storage, short-term, month-to-month? You know, what does that really look like, and how does it operate similarly or different from like a commercial public storage business?
It's the same as garages too, which is we get a lot of contractors, electricians, plumbers, that type of thing, dropping their stuff off, their materials off, you know, their
Greg, could you come up to the microphone for the public? If we can't pick you up if you're not at the microphone. Thank you.
So we get a lot of contractors, electricians, plumbers, that type of thing, dropping their vans off, picking up their materials, and also hobbyists, car hobbyists, that type of thing. We get cars there, campers, that type of thing. So it's, I don't know if you call it long-term or temporary.
I was thinking about the element of no parking lot and how, dropping off keys, and if it were more of a short-term thing, the administrative lift and how that office environment would work without.
What we have in our lease is you can't be there longer than 3 hours a day. So you can't operate a business there, you can't come there and spend half the day there and leave, because we don't have any bathrooms.
It's also set up where they have to call, make an appointment, if they're first time leasing, they have to make an appointment to arrive and meet at the site. That's where they would get the keys, is when they meet at the site, that kind of thing. So it's a by appointment only type process.
And I understand, talking about the buffer, I understand the buffer and the intent of the buffer. And so, on this site, is it to stop me looking at the solar panels? Or so the solar panels can't look at me? Because there's definitely no houses back there. And it's the ugliest thing that you'd ever want to see. And I was told by this staff that that's no longer permitted in Corcoran, which is good, because it is a sight to behold from my site looking north. So I don't see why this buffer, they're not gonna build houses there. And on the west side, we have a creek that's in woods that are about 150, 200 feet. East side. And an elevation change, it probably drops 50 feet and goes back up. And there's probably 200 feet of trees between me and the house, farmer's house to the east.
Are we still in the public hearing? portion
Yeah,
of this?
they're-
I'm also confused.
yes.
because We should close the public hearing
Okay.
before we move into discussion.
Thank
on
you.
recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Can I get a motion to close the public hearing?
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Is this the, where you wanted to see? Okay.
Unless my colleagues object or if someone else would like to lead off, I would be prepared to start off with the discussion.
Prior to discussion, can we just ask a question of Kendra? And could you please just give a blurb on the historical timeline for MUSA that was in this area? Just kind of the history of when it was projected, where it's at, what it's looking like for the future.
This is in the urban service area. It is the municipal boundary, so it's the end of the pipe, so to speak. The property was, has been in the MUSA since at least the 2020 comprehensive plan. It is in the final stage, which is I believe it's 2035 to 2040. I may be wrong on the starting date, but the final phase. I would also note that this area is in a study area in the 2040 comprehensive plan. So we were initially expecting, as we did the 2030 plan, that we would have a joint sewer system with Loretto, Medina, and Maple Plain. And as we got into the 2040 plan, there were some changes, and long story short, it's in a study area. So it is not planned to get sewer and water until sometime post-2030.
Chair, I also have a procedural question for staff, if I could ask that before discussion. Just curious, based upon the unique characteristics of this piece of property, that we're adjacent to the Medina and the Greenfield, and there's a public hearing notification requirement. So does that still carry over even though it is adjacent community, so people in both Greenfield and Medina also got a notification of the hearing this evening? And then Kendra,
Yep, Mr. Chair, Counselor Horn, I'm sorry, Commissioner Horn, The notice is a radius, so it would include the properties within 350 feet. And so that was sent out by the planning technician. And we spoke with Greenfield staff directly, so they're aware of it too. I don't think we talked with the Medina staff, but they did get notification in the area, so.
Yeah, I know Kendra had mentioned that you guys had some conversations with Greenfield. I was just curious what Medina's perspective was on it. There had not been discussions.
We have not had any calls, at least to me and Dwight, from Medina residents on the property.
Well, before we get to the CUP and the variances, I want to start with the threshold issue, the rezoning application, which also implicates the conditional use permit. The staff report reads on the second page under surrounding properties that, quote, "The property that surrounds the site to the north and east is guided light industrial and zoned urban reserve. The site abuts the city of Greenfield to the west and the city of Medina to the south across Highway 55. The property to the west within Greenfield is zoned rural residential, and the property to the south within Medina is zoned rural residential urban reserve. The existing use of the surrounding properties appears to be agricultural and single-family residential. Therefore, this indicates to me that the surrounding properties are not zoned light industrial. It may be guided that way, but surrounding properties are not, in fact, zoned that way now. My concern is that this is spot zoning. Essentially, the way I understand spot zoning is just like it sounds. One parcel of land is zoned differently than those around it. In some cases, it is an illegal practice. I could envision someone arguing, well, it's guided this way. However, guided doesn't mean it's zoned that way now, and it's certainly not guided for spot zoning. It must grow to get there. It cannot just be miracled into place somehow. There are also 3 variance requests. One for the buffer yard, one to start without municipal services, and one to have a 20-foot setback where 50 is required. I would like to start with the variance related to the buffer yard. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially the applicant is saying that he doesn't need buffer yards because the neighboring properties already have their own. This is not what the law says. It says that the responsibility for the buffer yards falls to the property with the more intensive use. This proposal is the more intensive use. I don't believe that the applicant owns the surrounding property. Is the 20 feet on the other side of the property line going to be preserved by easement with the other landowner? If that's the case, I'd like to see that easement. If not, I don't see how the applicant can claim to preserve the off-site vegetation because it's not his to preserve or remove for that matter. There is no authority in the city code that I have found that permits any of this. I don't see anywhere that permits using your neighbor's property to fulfill a requirement of the code. And lastly, because this is a variance, I do not see that there is a hardship here that isn't economically driven. I see no reason why the applicant couldn't comply with this code. His only problem is that the footprint of the building is too large. That is my same thought for the setback variance. I also want to touch on 2 things noted by the staff report for us to consider with respect to the buffer yard variance request. One thing that the staff report notes for the commission to discuss is whether a buffer yard is required for property that abuts other property outside of the city of Corcoran's boundaries. I assume that this question is whether border parcels still need to buffer on the side that abuts a different city. I think the answer to that is a firm yes. First, it's neighborly, but also the code does not provide two different standards. It does not say that, quote, properties abutting other jurisdictions or cities are exempted from the requirement of a buffer yard. Second, the report also mentions the future street easement and whether that can count towards the buffer yard requirement. I think that if the easement is there, but it's undeveloped, it should count. It is still within the property line, but I could be swayed on this. I'd like to thank my colleagues for indulging me in sharing my long-winded comments, but with that, I welcome to hear what others have to say.
May I, Chair?
Yes, please.
Because it's all interconnected, I'm just gonna share thoughts on each of the issues, understanding that because it's so interconnected, even if we, are fine with or believe that approval should be granted to part of it, it may result in the recommendation that it's all denied. I can understand that the development ahead of the MUSA, utilizing it for a purpose prior to, especially if the purpose does not require municipal city water and city sewer. That is something that I would recommend, approval of if that on its own was the only condition. With that, I did look at the surrounding area, I am aware of what's there. So even considering flexibility with the setback for the north side, the buffer, or the 20-foot setback to residential where 50 is required, I believe that should be held firm on the east and west sides. But then taking into consideration the street, 55, as part of that buffer or setback, that's fine with me. I would move forward with that. And I understand that it is just farmland to the north. However, my concern is picking up on that grading difference, the impact to that farmland. And again, I know that they would have been notified of this and they have every opportunity to pursue that, but I would just be curious if all of a sudden we're going to 8 feet higher, how that's not gonna impact. Do you want to speak to that?
Yes.
Sure.
The easement on the north side is not just
Can
something.
you please go to the mic, please?
To go up to the front.
Yes, please.
It's not something that I just want to use the neighbor's property and use the neighbor's trees. When Kendra brought this to my attention, I told Kendra I'm going to go buy an easement. So I have approached the neighbors to buy a conservation easement. They've agreed to do that. Kendra said hold off until we go through the whole process.
Sure.
I have done the same thing in Otsego. Why they have the ability to cut them trees down now. So if I go buy an easement, they can't cut the trees down. So why plant more trees? There's a forest there. At that particular point, the first on the east side, I can't see the electrical, the solar panels. So, it makes sense. I asked Kendra, I'm meeting the intent of the ordinance. Do I have to meet the letter of the ordinance? To me, that doesn't, what are we accomplishing there? I don't know. So,
Thank you. Sure.
Comment about grading. I don't know if it would be helpful to pull up the grading plan. The grading contours, we are proposing to tie those down within the boundaries.
Okay.
We're not proposing to grade out onto the adjacent property anywhere. Ken did make a comment that we're grading in MnDOT right-of-way. Well, what that's doing is removing the accesses that are there. There's an existing driveway access to that old house. There's an existing field approach. We know that as part of MnDOT's permits, they're going to request any existing driveways and accesses be removed. So we're showing that on our plan that yes, those would be removed. So that's the only things that are being done outside the boundaries of the property. No impact to the field, no impact to the north, no impact to the east outside the boundary at all.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, except for that landscaping that's off-site on the northwest corner.
Okay, thank you. Well, in my opinion, the ordinance standards have not been met for this application, and I make a motion to recommend denial of the request for the rezoning, the CUP, and on 2 of the 3 variances, the buffer yard variance and the setback variance. Can I get a second?
Sure, I have a few other questions for
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
staff.
I thought discussion.
Yeah, no, I just wanna make sure we're thorough because it will help the process moving
Oh,
forward
sure.
rather than
No.
just a complete shutdown. Go ahead, I may chime in afterwards as well. I have to check through my notes.
I guess my thoughts and comments were on variance number 1, municipal services. I understand that as my cohorts have said on the planning commission. I don't think that's a concern. I'm not concerned about that. Since my time on the planning commission, the buffering and screening, if it hasn't been the most significant issue we struggle with, it's been one of the top 3. And I know we've gone through efforts to try to address that so that as we evaluate proposed developments in the future, we have some tools in the toolbox to help us address that. And I'm concerned about any precedents that we do in this particular case that could impact future development proposals just because it's a relatively new thing. And as I said, this has been a significant issue that we've been struggling with pretty much in any development we've seen. That being said, I guess some of the things that staff presented, and I guess I wanted to comment on the whole issue of landscaping requirements with the development plus buffering. I think that landscaping should be additive. It should be the landscaping that's required with the development plus whatever the buffering is. I had some concerns and comments about the temporary easement. I didn't understand why would that be a temporary easement if in essence you're basically acquiring the land to preserve the ability to have the landscaping. We did get a little bit of an explanation on why temporary but not permanent, but I guess my question would be if that was a permanent easement, whereas the developer was actually acquiring that land for his purposes for staff, would staff still be concerned regarding impacting the proposed ordinance, or would that address some of those staff concerns?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, from a technical standpoint, it would still require the variance. And so we talked about this specific issue when we were writing the ordinance. And one of the challenges that there are cities that will allow that. And the challenge that we talked about is ultimately you're restricting someone else's property. Even if the current landowner agreed to it, that's a permanent restriction. And I believe the commission, but certainly the council, felt like that was not appropriate for what they were trying to accomplish. And so they were very intentional about saying it needed to be on this property. The council could change their mind. It exists in other cities, but it does need to be permanent. Otherwise, I think you're undermining the intent of the ordinance. So from a technical standpoint, staff is still concerned because that's not what the ordinance says.
But permanent would help address the concern relative to temporary. And a permanent easement can always be vacated in the future. If land use changes, you vacate the easement and it still has the land available to develop, correct?
That's true.
So, I mean, in terms of the issues on the east side and on the south, or on the west side and on the south side, I mean, because of Highway 55 and that future public roadway right-of-way, I really don't think we have issues there. It's really the north and the east. I guess the question, comment that I would have is that if it was a permanent easement, wherein basically the developer was acquiring the land to be able to address the buffering and setback requirements, is that something the planning commission could support?
I think that, I think the challenges, and I hear you, but the challenges is because it's being developed ahead of being rezoned. So that's why we're running into some of these letter of the law type of scenarios. And so I do believe that in acquiring that, you'd be preserving the intent by creating a buffer. But I think in the future, it shouldn't. The intent of the ordinance was not to utilize someone else's property, especially if it was a larger rural residential plot. It wasn't to use their property to create the buffer zone. And so I would also, the question on that, meaning should we specify it in the ordinance, because you did say that it wasn't actually specified in terms of the language indicating that that buffer zone had to be on the specific parcel property. I would be in support of that language moving forward, that it needs to be on that parcel.
That is in the code.
That is in the code.
Yeah, the part if I could, just
No,
to clarify,
please.
the part that's not specifically in the code is it doesn't specifically say the number of plants required in the buffer are in addition to the development ones. But the code's very clear that it's a permanent easement and the entire buffer needs to be on the subject property.
Okay, And so the challenge in this particular case is because it is being sought to be developed prior to it being rezoned. Because if we were to actually get to that point where everything in that area is not just guided, but actually zoned to industrial, then those requirements would not be what they are today.
Correct.
General comments, I think everyone's had some really nice words, and I think you're heard for sure. Many of the thought that's in this proposal is reasonable. I think, there's a lot of mixed variables here. We have multiple cities coming together, and this services Corcoran, but many of the clients would be Greenfield and Medina and others. I agree on maintaining the buffer ordinance, next to a residential property. Some of the comments about how it can look like spot zoning or that tendency is pushing the industrial agenda forward when we're in a scenario with many ifs. And I think we need some more detail, some of the tree detail, some of, it just seems a bit incomplete. I have questions about security measures as well. I know the lighting would be something that would be required, but that was another question. So I'm also in a state where I think at this point it's a denial position, but there's definitely the concept has some opportunities going forward.
Any other comments?
Was there anything else specific that you wanted, on a singular issue, the planning commission to weigh in on that we haven't been clear?
One minor issue is simply the applicant didn't provide information about the lap siding and the question of whether, in this case, the lap siding would be an appropriate material.
Personally, I would be fine with the lap siding as long, at this juncture, as if it were to be developed ahead of NUSA, then that would be an acceptable building material that I would be okay with.
I agree.
Okay, thank you. Well, again, in my opinion, the ordinance standards have not been met for this application, and I will make a motion to recommend denial of the request for the rezoning, the CUP, and on 2 of the 3 variances, the buffer yard variance and the setback variance. Can I get a second, please?
I'll second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? And the application is recommended for denial.
Will this recommendation still go to council?
On the 24th of August.
Moving on, reports and other business, adult use cannabis regulations discussion. Who's leading this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am leading it somewhat, but we also have Jessica Bizey online. She's done most of the legwork with City Council to move this regulation discussion forward. I got involved when they wanted to start discussing potential buffer ideas, so I did some GIS analysis. So we're going to tag team it here. I can start out, Jess.
Sounds great.
All right, so just a reminder, the City Council has requested for the Planning Commission to provide feedback on the appropriate zoning districts to allow the sale of lower potency cannabis products, also known as edible cannabinoids, that were legalized with the 2022 legislation. Obviously, additional legislation came out in 2023, but interim ordinance moratorium is expected to be put in place by our City Council in August. And so that will be a different component that we handle later on over the next year. Today, we're just focusing on the discussion of where we would like to have the licenses for lower potency products. So these would not be stores specifically catering to, they wouldn't necessarily have it be like a cannabinoid shop. These are more like gas stations or liquor stores that are selling this in addition to other products. So basically, some of the questions that need to get answered are how many licenses should be allowed. The city attorney thinks that we have some ability to have a density limit. And then the city council wanted to look at potentially having some kind of radius limitation. So in addition to it only being in a certain district, if there is some type of land use nearby, they specifically said public land in their meeting back in July, then the idea that so many feet, there wouldn't be a license in that area. So I created in the packet 2 maps. One was going off of the public land idea that city council asked for. So I will go ahead. So just to kind of walk through it. So this light green that's about to pop up is the public land in the city. Some of it's a little bit of a guesstimate because the land hasn't been quite divided according to Hennepin County parcels yet. So like right here, the entirety of Hope Community Church is not public land, but the water tower technically is. And so that's why that's highlighted. And then we have some public parkways and like City Park, and the parks down in Tavera and Ravinia are off the screen. So the idea that they had at council was a 2,500 foot buffer, which is pretty large and limits it to, if we were to say that it could go into all of our commercial districts, which we have 3 of them, this would limit it down to 7 properties with eligibility. Most of them are concentrated on the west side of our city, which is probably the least developed at this time. And also primarily concentrated where we have a consolidation of contractors' operations, so they're fairly unlikely to sell this. So it was some concern with the city attorney about basically putting an effective ban with this type of radius. So I did, for the sake of comparison, a 500-foot radius, which is much smaller, and that would allow 36 properties, I believe, potentially could have a license. Again, we further limit that with density. Yep.
I'm sorry. Could you go back and tell me what the city attorney said, that if we're recommending is it a 1,500?
2,500.
2,500,
Mm-hmm.
and what's the concern?
The idea is if we're going to consolidate it to our contractors' operations, they're going to not necessarily be likely to sell that, so we're putting an effective ban by saying that it can only be sold in a contractor's operations, a district that's primarily utilized by contractors' operations.
Okay, and is the city attorney concerned that this will result in litigation?
Yes.
Based on what?
That people, so the idea is, and Jess, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, yeah.
Go ahead.
I think the idea is just limiting it by that, limiting it to that number of properties creates the room for folks to say that that we've effectively banned it by only allowing it on 7 properties within the city.
May I also clarify that it's more restrictive, the legislation in 2023, and so some of their language in the statutes that were passed, even though we're complying with 2022, the other piece of that is that the state statutes from 2023 become more restrictive on the boundary that cities can put around these locations, to the point that it specified 1,000 feet from a school and 500 feet from other areas. So I think some of the discussion is why start large if the requirement is going to be to comply with 2023 legislation. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that is exactly it. So the idea being, we don't really know exactly how this is going to play out, but knowing that, so once that was the second map, is based on those radiuses, which is the city attorney recommendation. But knowing that that's been established, and that's for cannabis shops, it's unlikely that it's going to be a harder argument to have a 2,500 foot buffer for something that's licensed as more of an accessory product that is not the entire focus of the business. So, but for the sake of running through the exercise to be able to see everything, I did the 2,500 buffer as requested, and then I did a 500 foot buffer, which does limit it to 36 properties, does open it up a bit more. However, if we do the city attorney recommendation, that is, we have licensed daycares, schools, parks with amenities such as athletic fields and playgrounds. And then we have an 1,000-foot buffer from schools, a 500-foot buffer from parks with amenities, and a 500-foot buffer from licensed daycare. And so applying those buffers, we're left with 30 properties in the various commercial districts throughout the city. We don't have it consolidated on one side of the city that could potentially have a license. And then the idea from there is the city attorney is recommending that we allow at least 2 licenses throughout the city. And we could do that, or we could also make it a bit easier to say, since we're going by district, maybe 1 license per district, and so that would be 3, but we could also do the 2. I just don't know exactly how that would work if we're doing it by a district limit, because we have 3 commercial districts, and that's what he had proposed.
So the bottom two blocks there, did the city attorney recommend those 2 or not recommend those 2? At the bottom, commercial properties 500 feet away, public land 500.
So what I currently have checked, the 30 properties, limiting it to 30 commercial properties, this is based off of the city attorney recommendation of the radiuses that we could utilize, that he thinks would be in the spirit of the legislation that we're basing this off of.
And how does the city attorney's recommendations compare to current statute, not what may be coming in a year or 2?
So there are go ahead, Jess.
I was going to say from currently there is not a requirement for us to put a limitation on it. So we did go through the process of doing a moratorium with the 2022 legislation. And so the recommendation before you tonight and council is really to try to set ourselves up to have some regulations. Otherwise, if we do not move forward with a regulation such as this that has some sort of limiting it to commercial districts, there's an ability to have additional. There's not a limit. So this is us putting in some regulation related to it that we've not had. The ordinance or the state statute does not require that we do this. It's just something that we had discussed with the council back in 2022. And now, as Natalie had mentioned, there are things coming with the 2023 legislation, and we are planning to do that moratorium. So we're trying to set ourselves up to set regulations that can work with that future legislation that is coming. Those future rules.
Okay, thank you.
So basically, there's no requirement for a buffer at all, so they're trying to figure out what buffer to put in place.
Yeah, well, I think that the city attorney's recommendations, I mean, regardless of your feelings on the topic, I think that the city attorney's recommendations seem reasonable to me. I guess my only thing is school's 1,000 and the daycare is 500. I don't understand that. I guess if I were to recommend any changes to what the city attorney is recommending, is I would raise the buffer around licensed daycares to equal that of a school. But other than that, I don't really have any.
Can I ask a couple questions related to, so one of the other uses, although we might not have any in the city right now, but is a drug treatment facility. I think it would be beneficial to have a radius from a drug treatment facility if one were to ever come into the city. And then also, because technically, according to state statute, this is something that you can utilize on your own private residential properties. If a licensed daycare was in a home, a personal home, how does that impact the neighbors?
So
Do they know, you know what I mean?
I put a 500-foot buffers on the licensed home daycares in the city.
Right, so then do their neighbors know that because they have a neighbor that chooses to operate a licensed daycare in them, that they cannot then utilize, do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, but I don't, this isn't utilizing the products, this is where they can
Selling,
be
that's right.
sold.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So
Okay,
I
that's
believe,
right.
I believe
Thank
that's
you
a
for
separate
clarifying.
issue that, as far as where it
Right,
can
right.
be, where, that's gonna be a
Where-
separate
yep.
issue as to where you can use it, if anywhere
Right.
publicly. Otherwise, people that use it on their private property, it doesn't matter if it's a license next door.
That's great, thank you very much for clarifying and reminding me of that. Okay, so I did go to the League of Minnesota Cities and start reading through the recommendations on this topic, and I found it to be incredibly helpful. One of the things that I would just, and I'm not challenging the city attorney in any way at all, but they indicated that that a ratio was 1 to every 12,500 residents. And so my thing isn't there, doesn't it seem more plausible, instead of picking a number and setting it at that with the population that we have right now, can't we just set some sort of a ratio so that as growth happens, do you know what I mean? So like, basically, if there was a city of like 60,000 people and you're following that math, there's only gonna be 4.8 licenses allowed in that city. Couldn't we do something like that, where we say we're gonna accept this ratio, and that allows for growth as you grow, but then that also, sets a density?
That, that ratio is for the sale, the exclusive sale of the high potency cannabis. There is not a limit on, there's that license,
Okay, so it's
the
not on the
licensure number is
edibles
for the
and,
higher potency things that are coming. And so
okay,
I envision that the planning commission will be seeing more, as well as the city council will be seeing this topic come up, because we'll have to look at testing facilities and manufacturing facilities and making determinations on all of those things as well in the next year and a half. So we have until 2020, if we do move forward with the moratorium as proposed, we have until January 1st, 2025 to make any land use changes related to this.
thank you, Jessica, for explaining. I still think that some sort of a ratio and applied for population and density would work even for the edibles. I, for one, would prefer to not see them in convenience stores. That's somewhere like my kids bike to the gas station and pick up ice cream treats in the summer. And so I think if what we're considering is, you know, the type of sale that we want to be made, like, there is sort of that convenience pickup, I'm gonna go get milk, I'm gonna go get whatever, right? And then there's like specialty shopping, like, and isn't that what some of the different commercial areas, like the rural commercial versus C1 and C, like, doesn't that indicate that there's a difference in terms of the shopping that people intend to do when visiting those districts?
That was actually gonna be one of my questions, because it said staff identified 3 commercial districts. If we took the neighborhood commercial out, the C1 out, how would that impact the number of properties that would be available? And then we'd have 2 districts instead of 3, and then we could do a limitation of 1 in each district.
We could do something like that. We're looking at the commercial districts, like, while the community commercial, I think, is the idea, is it is a broader type of commercial use. The neighborhood's more for smaller commercial use, a little more pocketed. Overall, there are very similar uses allowed, and so just from a zoning standpoint, I struggle with, well, if we're going to allow it here, why wouldn't we allow it here? But having said that, if that's your recommendation, then we could certainly apply that.
Because that kind of
I
ties
feel
to
like
you,
that-
that's in the neighborhoods versus the community more, and if we did that, it helps eliminate some of the neighborhood parcels.
Right. I would be more prone to desire that rather than allowing it in all of the uses. I think, my only question related to 1 in each district is, does that mean that government is any way interfering with competition? That would be my only, like, you know.
We're definitely
Right,
the invisible hand
right.
right now, yes, is what we're doing, but that's,
They can go to Maple
That's
Grove
what
and go to
Sure, so all around the
Mhm.
metro there is competition, and I
Mhm.
just, I also want to just for consideration, in terms of limiting just one to each district. Could you just, could it be that there's so many allowances, and then regardless of what district it is, there's just this many licenses we're gonna issue for this, and then the first two to take the application and get everything done, then those are the ones that have it, even if they're in the same area?
I think the idea is to kind of cap it, so that's why, like, for the idea of 30 commercial properties between the 3 districts, and then if we were to allow 3 overall, then that caps it so that we're not consolidating it all in one district or one area of the city. We're kind of spreading it out a bit more, for better or for worse. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but that's just the logic from my brain, but there's other arguments that can be made. So if you wanted it to be just something like, the first 2 properties that are within a qualifying district, that's it, and they get the license. It doesn't matter if they're next door to each other, or we can do that as well.
I would be curious to have public safety weigh in on that. Like, if I hear a logical argument for why it's safer or better to have it spread out versus consolidated, I think aside from hearing that argument, I would just say this many licenses, whoever is the qualifying business that fills out the application, regardless of where they are allowed to do it. I guess that would be the route that I would go, but I'm definitely open to like hearing that there may be things that I'm missing in that discussion.
What kind of fees and taxes will these license holders be assessing?
Not very, Jess, go ahead with that.
Sure. So there's a limit to what we can charge for the licenses. It's about $125, I think, if I can remember correctly. And then for a license, we're limited by statute on how much we can charge for those. And then in terms of taxes, when it comes to the high potency piece, I think that there's a 10% revenue share that's coming back to cities related to that. But I don't know the tax off the top of my head of what is being charged to those folks. There's been a lot of discussion about how it could be a potential revenue source for cities.
And then can I ask an additional question? Like what direct known fees would there be to the city as a result of having these businesses? Like, do you have to do compliance checks? Is it just managing the process of licensing? Like, what does it take from I'm thinking about cities' costs to just even implement this, versus that revenue stream coming in.
There are compliance checks similar to tobacco and liquor. So those are definitely something that is a part of it, and then just administering the license. We are limited to what is allowed under state statute for the license fees. Similar to liquor licensing, it's when the high potency ones licenses come through, they'll be passed through fees, and we'll have to do compliance checks for those as well.
Okay, and thank you for mentioning the tobacco, because that does remind me, like, if it were going to be in the neighborhood commercial, is it sold behind the counter?
Absolutely, they have to be carded just like liquor and tobacco, and that's the thinking of why.
And it isn't like out and available?
No, and that's the thinking of why gas stations are better set up, because they already have IDing processes in place, and they're regularly checked to comply with those standards.
Okay.
So they're more set up than your flower shop. So
I was just envisioning, I'm sorry, like, gummies available where like Sour Patch Kids are, and thank you, Jessica, for mentioning that. I'm glad you did, because I guess with that in mind, then I wouldn't see a reason to restrict it, because most of what's in those neighborhood commercial is gas stations.
Mm-hmm.
So I would not see a reason to necessarily eliminate that district as an available, or at that zone.
I would also, to the comment about per district or
and I don't know if we, I don't know if we really have data to support it either way. So I think, if there's a recommendation between 2 or 3, we can go from there, but I think the recommendation to council, or to the city attorney as he's drafting this, the idea that it's just, it can be in one of these 3 districts, up to 2 licenses in the city overall, I think that's something he could work in the wording. I don't think that's impossible.
And part of me says you have logic to the number, so if there's 3 districts, 3 licenses, everybody has an opportunity. If you took it, great, if you didn't, also. But,
Yeah.
so, I guess between 2 or 3, I don't really necessarily have a strong opinion, but I think it would make sense to have as many licenses as we have districts, but maybe that will grow over time, and that logic will make sense.
And I also think that with the city attorney recommendation for radiuses, it leaves about 30 properties. I think 3, so it's like a 10%.
Yeah,
There's
I
just
like that.
logic behind it that we can use to support if it were ever to be challenged.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking 10%.
Thank you.
Natalie, do you know how many parcels would need to be eliminated to C1?
So basically, we would be eliminating, let's see here, this area right here, oops, the existing downtown area, which includes the gas station, the flower shop, the pet store, things like that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And then we would also be removing,
So more than that,
So almost that, yeah.
more than that.
yeah, and then we'd be removing up here too, which is also currently C1. So, and that's, yeah, so 14, yeah, so it would reduce it quite a bit. And again, as far as gas stations, I would say Crossroads is pretty set up for proper IDing procedures. So I don't know if that necessarily makes sense to prevent them from that kind of revenue if they choose to.
I would still just be curious about a ratio, thinking about growth. But if we initially started out with a number of licenses, then I would endorse the 3 for the 3 districts, since all the numbers seem to work out. But I would be really curious moving forward if it just was somehow related to population density.
I agree.
So, 3 districts, maximum of 3, when we agree with the latest recommendations of the city attorney.
Save the recommendation to potentially make it a larger radius from licensed daycares. And then maybe the additional residential treatment facilities, even though we don't actually have any.
Yeah, we would have, so, well, I can definitely take that recommendation back to the city attorney. I believe, again, the radiuses that he's proposing are based on the 2023 legislation, and the maximum you can do from a licensed daycare is 500 feet using that. So just trying to use that same logic, considering that's for the higher potency, so just, but, and I don't know if I don't know if we're prevented from identifying other land uses such as a drug. I think it makes sense. So we can take that back, and we'll go from there, but those are the 2 that I don't know if the city attorney is going to agree on, but we can take that back as your recommendation.
Fair enough. Is there anything we did not discuss that are needed to related to that?
Don't believe so. Jess, was there anything else?
No, I don't think so. I think I really appreciate your feedback. Just a note that one of the things that will go in to effect with this is the council is looking at not allowing public use in the public parks as well, and some language related to drug paraphernalia related to the 2023 legislation. So that's those are some ancillary things, but I do think that we'll be having more discussion about how all of these pieces of the very extensive cannabis legislation, how we'll be enacting those as they come up with the regulations related to the Office of Cannabis Management. And so more to come on the future in that high potency stuff for us. Thank you all.
Jessica, can you clarify, is the not using in public spaces, is that for the edible cannabinoids?
No, that is for
That's
all
the high
cannabis.
potency.
Yeah, so we're
All.
that is for high potency and low potency. Our regulations don't go into effect until later for the sale of the high potency. But as of Tuesday, you're able to utilize cannabis and have possession of so much um, on private property.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Moving on, planning project update.
I don't have anything to add from the report prepared by Dwight, but if you have any questions, please let me know.
Nope. And council member Schultz was unable to join us tonight, I guess, so.
Then can I ask a question of staff related to more of a city council issue rather than, I mean, it could, okay. So I saw a for sale sign on the butcher shop, so I know that there had been a question of would they actually be able to continue to use that as a butcher shop after the death of the owner this December. So anyway, my question is this, one of the things that has come out is that city ordinance does not allow on-site, that there isn't a place that a business could operate as a butcher shop? Is that?
Correct, yeah, it's a non-conforming use.
Right,
Yep.
yep, so we couldn't there, but then part of the problem, because there had been some discussion at a council meeting about like, could city swap, because the city had said, oh, maybe we want that parcel, and I know it had just been thrown out there, so I'm not saying that I'm latching onto that, but what I latched onto was the fact that there is no place where a business could operate that way, so are we pursuing a change to that in terms of our city?
Not at this time, so if the applicant comes back saying that, so I think what could happen is if they don't sell it to another butcher between now and the year marker, that the business operation ceased, then at that time there is some support for them to come in with a zoning ordinance amendment to allow for the use within the district, but we would have to study it a bit more because they can clog up things, to my understanding, like septic systems and things. So there are standards that we'd want to put in place to bring it in compliance with the general rule of thumb for this type of use, and we just don't currently have that laid out in code. So we're not doing anything proactively on that at this point, but the applicant did receive some feedback from council to suggest if they need to come in the future, they'd be willing to discuss it at that point. So.
Okay. I just am thinking, not indicating that we as a city need to be proactive, but I know that the loss of that butcher shop is sending a lot of people to other towns to purchase their meat from other locations. And so, not that this particular business needs to reoperate, or then reopen and operate as a butcher shop, but it is an incredible commodity, desirable by the city. So if the city would consider and be open to making it allowable at least, then if someone had a business that they wanted to open, you know, if I was a butcher and looking at a place to open and there wasn't even an allowance for it in our city code, I guess I'd be less likely to approach the city because it would seem like a more arduous process. So I would encourage the city to consider being more proactive rather than reactive on that topic.
I have a question. Northeast Hackamore 116.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that that's come before us, correct?
No.
It's going just to get feedback from city council?
Correct. It
Is that
received feedback at the July 27th meeting because it was just a sketch plan.
Sure.
It would come in front of you as a preliminary plat application should they move forward.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion? Anyone? Can I get a motion to, or is there anything
Calendar.
else? What?
The calendar, does that work for everyone?
Yes.
Calendar still good? If anything comes up last minute, like if you give me a day or two buffer, call me and I can cover for you if something comes up. Otherwise, can I get a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.